Fantastic. So welcome to the next Wilderness Labs DevCamp session. My name is Adrian Stevens, and here we're going to talk about, well, getting started with Meadow. So perhaps you're thinking about picking up a new Meadow board, or maybe you already have one. Maybe you have one just like this sitting in front of you, and you're wondering, well, what do I need to do to get that board ready for development? How do I set up my development? Perhaps on Windows, maybe even on a Mac, and what's required to deploy your very first C#.NET application. Well, I'm going to show all that to you and maybe a little more in this session, so let's get started. So I'm going to walk you through the steps for both Windows and Mac, and regardless of where you're starting, you're going to start at the Wilderness Labs website, specifically developer.wildernesslabs.com. And that's because there's a few things you're going to need to download. So we'll start with Windows, and we'll use Visual Studio 2019. And we're going to head to the Meadow guides. And specifically, I want to go to the Deploy Meadow OS section. And notice here I have some installation instructions for Visual Studio. And again, this is for 2019. And without going through all of this in detail, of course, this is all on the website, so you can read through it. Click on this downloading it link. And this is going to take you to the VS Tools for Meadow installer. You're going to need this installed, and this is an add-on, an extension for Visual Studio 2019. And this is what's going to enable you to create new Meadow projects and deploy them to your Meadow board. So I already have that installed on my Windows machine. If you don't, go ahead and click that button. And now let's pop over to Visual Studio. So with that installed, I'm going to create a brand new project. And if I search for Meadow, you're going to see there's now a Meadow application type. Let's click on this. And I'm going to put this somewhere handy. Let's call this DevCamp. And let's go my first app. And let's create our brand new project. Give this just a moment. And I'm actually going to do something just a little bit funny here. So I'm going to create the project, and then we're not going to look at it right away, because we're going to make sure that our Meadow board is all set. All right, so I flipped on my Meadow camera, because I want to show you how to get this updated and ready for development. So I'm going to plug it into my development machine, but I want to put it in a mode that allows us to update the firmware or the OS on our Meadow board. So to do that, I'm going to put it into bootloader mode, and we do that by holding down the boot button while we plug in or power our board. This now loads it into bootloader mode and enables it to update the OS, which we can do right from Visual Studio. So let's try that out. Come to View, Other Windows, and look for Meadow. And we want the Meadow Device Explorer. And here we can download Meadow OS, so we'll download the latest version of the OS from the servers. And then because we're in bootloader mode, we would push the Flash Device button. This would actually write Meadow OS to the board. I'm not going to do that right now just because it takes a minute or two and I want to keep this moving. But you should absolutely do this when you get your brand new Meadow board. And so now let's put this into, well, development mode. So I'm going to show you this here. We've got this button that says refresh device ports. This actually is going to scan for all the COM or communication ports on our PC. And right now I only have one, COM1. This is actually a real COM port on my desktop machine. And we want to look for the one for our Meadow board. It's fortunately relatively straightforward. So we're still in bootloader mode, so let's get this in non-bootloader mode. We can push the reset button. I want to make this very explicit, make sure it works. So I'm going to unplug the cable and plug it back in. Just ensure it resets. Click the refresh device ports button, hit the drop down. There it is, COM4. That is our Meadow board. So you can close the Meadow Device Explorer, and let's see if everything's working now. So to do that, I'm going to push the deploy button. Now, if you're watching the screen, you'll notice that it's actually flashing the onboard LED, and that's because when you get your board, your brand new board, it already has a version of Meadow OS installed on it, and it has an application. These are, I think today, are hand tested to make sure these are working for you. So we're actually going to flash a new copy of this app. And you can see that the lights are flashing, they're just flicking different colors. This new version is a little bit cooler. So I'm going to hit the deploy button. This is going to actually compile our default application. I know we haven't looked at the code yet, This is going to deploy an updated version of that color changing application, or that Blinky app. And you can check out the output here. You can see it's initializing Meadow, it's checking for some files. And now this is your first time deploying an app with a fresh Flash. It will actually write some of those base class libraries, those DLLs that you need for your Meadow application. We're going to look at those a little bit more detail in a few moments. But that first deploy could be a little bit longer, a couple minutes. And so now our app is running, and let's see if it's easy to see on the camera or not. But it's actually they're fading in between colors. We've actually deployed a new application. We're going to come back and tweak this in a minute. But before we do that, I want to show you how to do the exact same steps on macOS. So I do have a Mac running here on my desk, but rather than switch over to that, I'm going to use VNC to remote desktop to my Mac. And so here we see our Mac environment. And just like we did on Windows, I'm going to start with the developer.wildernesslabs.co website, because we love the Meadow guides. And I didn't point this out before, but there's actually a ton of fantastic information here. Not only about Meadow, not only about using the hardware capabilities and peripherals with Meadow, but also just general wiring and electronics as well. Tons of great info here. Highly recommend you spend some time. I'm a big fan of the electronic tutorials and the hardware and circuits. But for now, let's get our board set up. So back into the Getting Started guide. And again, we're going to deploy Meadow OS, but this time we're going to do it using DFU. And you can do this on Windows and Mac and even Linux, in fact. On Windows, though, we saw we can do it nicely through Visual Studio. On Mac, it's just a little bit more work. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you have your system configured. I'm just going to scroll down and find that section. There we go. Looking for brew install DFU util. One-time step. I've done that already, so you don't have to watch me do it. But run that command. And of course, if you don't have brew installed, you can install that as well. It is a free install homebrew for Mac. It takes a couple minutes, and then you're all set. So with DFU util installed, let's take a look and see what we can see on our Mac. So let me bring this onto camera. I'm going to add a second Meadow board here. This one below. Going to make this easy. I'm going to use a white cable on this one instead of a black. And I'm going to cheat and stick this guy down a little bit so it doesn't move around too much. So just like we did on Windows, we're going to put this into bootloader mode. So let's hold down the boot button and plug it in. Now, when we do that, we can now go over to the terminal. We can actually check to see if our board is plugged in. So here's my terminal. And to do this, I'm going to type in DFU util space hyphen list. And this is going to list all of the DFU capable devices on my Mac. Now, it turns out, for me, it's only this Meadow board. And you might be saying, what the heck? I see 4 things. It turns out you'll actually get 4 entries when your Meadow board is plugged in bootloader mode. But if you have a look, notice the serial numbers are all the same on all of these. Now you might find on other Macs or other hardware configurations, you actually will have some DFU capable devices. I've seen this with Mac keyboards, for example. So we do this because we want the serial number, and this is going to allow us to make sure that we're flashing the OS to the exact right spot. So with that set up, let's still download the OS. I'm going to scroll back up and go to downloads. And we're going to grab the latest version here. This is going to pop down. Now, I'm already signed into the website. If you're not signed in, it will ask you to sign in. And that's now in my downloads folder. And I'll just show you that I'm already here. And I already have, okay, look, there it is. There's my meadow os.bin file is ready to go. Now, in this case, I am going to flash it because I'm going to show you the whole step. And we can do a little bit of other work while that's happening. So let's go back into our instructions installation via DFU. I'm going to scroll down. And again, of course, all of these steps are outlined very nicely on the website. So if I'm scrolling quickly or miss a step, go ahead. They're all right here. And again, this will give you the instructions for bootloader mode. But what I really want is this command here of using DFU util. And notice here the nice screenshot showing you how to find the serial number. So you don't have to go back to this video, all on the website. And I want this command here. And this is the DFU util command to write our Meadow OS binary file to the right location on the board. This hex value here is actually quite important. So I'm going to copy this. return to the terminal. I'm going to paste this in. I'm going to do this the quick and easy way. So we'll paste. Then I'm going to copy the serial number from one of the above. Remember, they're all the same, so just grab one of them. And then, yeah, no magic here. Back with the cursor. And paste. So there's our dfutil command with the right serial number flashing our Meadow os.bin. And you can see this will go, and this takes a minute or two. Now, while that's happening, let's just move this down so we can actually keep an eye on it at the bottom of the screen, watch our progress go by. Now, let's open up Visual Studio. Now, just like on Windows, we want to make sure that we have the Meadow extension installed. And so with our Visual Studio for Mac in focus, up to the Visual Studio menu and extensions. I already have it installed, but if I didn't, we would search for it. We'll just give this a moment to pop up. There we are. Going to go to the gallery and search for just Meadow. Nice and easy. There it is. And I have this installed already, so I'm not going to uninstall it. But that's all set and ready to go. So just like on Windows, I can now create a new project. If we scroll down, you'll actually see a Meadow section. Meadow app, next. My first Meadow app. We'll hit the create button. And actually that timing is just about perfect. While that app is initializing, I'm gonna sneak back over here to my console and notice that we've finished writing our binary file so that we've updated to the latest version of Meadow OS. And just like we did previously, I'm gonna unplug that cable and plug it back in to be explicit. And I can validate if this is installed on my Mac. If you're comfortable in the Linux world, ls/dev tty.usb star usually comes in as USB modem 01, but depending on what device you have plugged in, you might see a different number. I'm pretty happy about that. I know my Meadow board is hooked up and ready to go. And let's check out Visual Studio. Now sometimes if it's not playing nicely, I might just need to restart Visual Studio to have it recognize my Meadow board. I'm just going to unplug it and replug it in just in case that helps. My first Meadow app. Let's open that up. And there we go. And I want to show that to you. It's nice to see there, sometimes turning off and on again is a good idea. We don't need to run our updates right now. And so now we've got our Meadow application ready to go. And you can see it's found the Meadow and its serial number. But for now, let's just push the play button. And very much like we saw on Windows, it's going to deploy the application. And I'm going to let that run in the background. I'm going to switch back over to Windows. But hopefully, as you'll see on the camera, you're eventually going to see the light kick on and we'll see our application running on our Mac here in just a moment. So I'm back on our Windows machine and I'm going to let the Mac deploy run in the background. It's actually still going, and this is going to give you a sense of how long it takes to actually set up a brand new board. So this board doesn't have any of the binary files installed, any of the DLLs. Actually, let me just switch back to that quickly and just show you. So it actually is writing those DLLs to our Mac. You can see it's transferring all those libraries that we need, and so our application will kick up here in just a moment. But while that's happening in the background, let's have a look at what makes up a Meadow project. And this is actually going to be quite familiar to you if you're a .NET developer. So start by looking at the project. I'm going to right-click and do Edit Project File. And notice it's a modern .NET project, nice and minimal. And today it's actually using the .NET Framework 4.7.2, and you'll likely see that update in the future. And this actually should look a lot like a .NET console application, if you're familiar with those project types. Of course, we are targeting the Meadow SDK, and this is going to ensure that we're pulling down the Meadow libraries, the base class libraries we need for that Meadow application, but otherwise very similar. And the similarity continues through other files. If we come right here to our program file, again, it's a .NET application. Here's our good old friend, public static void main. Even has the args parameter there. And then let's look at the actual Meadow specifics now. So here we're instantiating a Meadow app object. And you might notice there's a Meadow app.cs file over here. We'll look at that in a moment. And then we call thread.sleep, and this ensures that our application stays running. And this is so we can do asynchronous things, respond to events. We don't want our app to run and then follow it. Again, very much like a console application. Oh, and actually, if you look over, we can see both of our boards are flashing their lights here. And so we see our Mac deployment has completed. So let's continue our little tour. Back to Meadow app. There's a couple of fun things. I'm not going to go through everything in extreme detail, but I want you to get a sense of these applications because there's a little bit of hardware, but it's really just C#. So here's our class, Meadow app, and this derives from an app class. And it takes a generic and actually defines it as an F7 micro. This is actually quite important because this really defines the hardware, like the hardware shape and profile for the Meadow F7 specific board. That's going to be important here in just a moment. So we've got a Meadow app class. We saw that was back in program, that was instantiated. But we didn't actually run it. So where does that happen? If we come back to Meadow app, well, we'll look in the constructor. We can see there's a couple of methods being called, and this is actually doing the work. One, initialize, sets up our hardware, and then cycle colors is doing the actual application work. So initialize is a bit of a convention you'll see in Meadow applications, and we often will put our hardware initialization in a separate method, which is actually quite nice. And so for this particular app, this is all the hardware work. So we're instantiating an RGB PWM LED object. This is pretty cool. So this is an object that represents the multicolor LEDs you can see flashing on our two Meadow boards here. So yeah, it's a class, it's an object. We're going to have this in memory. It's a model object that represents our physical thing. And so we have to do a little bit of work to connect that up. So the first thing here is the first parameter we pass in is the device parameter. And this is actually a property on our app class. This comes in from our F7 micro definition. And so this enables our RGB PWM LED to properly communicate with our board. Now the other thing we have to do is tell it really where that LED is connected to. And so RGB LEDs, red, green, blue LEDs, they're really, not surprisingly, it's one unit. It is one light, one LED, but it's actually internally 3 LEDs. And so we use 3 connection points to drive it. We drive the red LED, the green LED, and the blue LED. Again, it's all wired. It's a nice tiny little package here, but internally there's 3 connections. So we specify that. Now this is actually really powerful. So remember we have this device property. This is defined as part of the F7 micro definition. And so notice this is quite cool. I'm going to delete this and show this to you. So on device, we have a pins property. And so this actually gives us access. This is how we connect to all of the physical pins on our board. And so for our S7 micro, for example, we have 16 digital I/O pins. These are pins that we can basically turn on or off and actually read signals the same way. They can be an output, so they could control LEDs, or they could read an input, like take an input from a button. We might give a high signal when the button is pressed and a low signal when the button is not pressed. Now there are 16 of those digital pins, 0 through 15, and there's actually there's some other pins that are wired internally for that onboard LED. Here we see it, onboard LED blue, green, and red. And I think it was the red one I deleted. Yeah, so let's put that back in. And then a few extra little bits and pieces that are specific to that hardware. These numbers set the voltage range, so we could actually control the brightness or make sure that we're not overdriving the LEDs to damage it. And then if you want to look at some electronics, and again, remember the developer website has lots of these tutorials. We can control whether our LEDs, our RGB LED has a common anode or common cathode. And that's just how it's wired. So we have 3 wires that drive the signal, and that could be those are 3 positive voltages, and then we have a common ground, or we could actually have a common positive voltage in and then 3 grounds coming out for the 3 lights. So with that, now sure, a little bit of hardware, but look at this. That's it. That's all of our hardware for this application. And now everything else is just C#. So our cycle colors method is now going to feel really comfortable. If that made you a little bit uncomfortable, it's okay. We'll just push that away. Cycle colors takes a parameter, 1000. What is that? Well, that's our duration. We use that in milliseconds, and that controls how fast it pulses. And then we've got a helper method here called showColorPulse. And you can jump into that. Notice it takes a color parameter. And that, of course, lets us set our colors, takes our duration. And then what we do here is we actually start the pulse. So we're telling the LED to start changing colors. And what this method does is a helper method to allow us go to a full brightness of a color and then dim it back down. But again, it's just C#. So watch this. So I'm gonna go onboard LED, right? That's the object we instantiate up here in our initialize method. And now we can just access methods and properties on this class. So for example, I can read the color value assigned to it. I can do things like just call set color, which will set a constant color, or use like these fun helper methods I said, like start pulse, start blink. And then you can call a stop method to make it turn off to stop doing things. So in this case here, I'm going to leave it at start pulse. And then we're going to pause here because we want it to go through one full cycle, right? So we pass in our duration. We tell it to start pulse at half that duration. That so it goes full brightness and then comes back down. And then we stop it. And of course, we could wrap this in tasks. This is modern C# as well. And we can make this asynchronous. But for the purposes of our simple demo, this is how we're wiring it up. So let me actually prove to you this is different. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to change our cycle. Let's do something a bit quicker. Something that makes sure it shows up on camera. I'm going to do 300. And I'm going to deploy this. And for simplicity for now, I'm going to unplug the Mac one, just so we can focus on the Meadow OS that's connected to our PC. Again, remember that is the black cable. Now notice this deployment, again, is quite fast. So our deployment is intelligent. It doesn't recopy files it doesn't need. So it's only going to move over the application file, the app.exe, that represents our C# app here. It's going to call cycle colors. And hopefully you can see that okay. I think it's coming through. Notice it's actually moving quite quickly. So hey, we've now deployed our second application and modified it. But let me make this a little bit more interesting. And I'm going to swap boards now. And I've actually wired up another board that has an RGB LED connected to it. So let's see another example of this. I'm just going to unplug this guy here and bring this into frame. So notice now, good, that's nice and sharp. So we have an RGB LED, an external one, and then it's actually wired into 3 pins. And I'm going to angle that. It's wired into pins digital D02, D03, and D04. So just another variation of that RGB LED. Let's slow it down just a little bit, make sure you can see that nicely. Let's plug it back in. So let's modify our application to control this onboard LED. So we'll go back to our initialize method. And so instead of using the onboard pins, I'll just unplug that for the moment so it doesn't flash too brightly. Let's change these pins now. So I'm going to use pins so D02, D03, and D04. I'm going to be totally honest. I can't remember which pin is for which color, so we're just going to put them in that order, but that might be slightly wrong. And if that's the case, then what you'll see is that the colors that it's changing won't match what we saw before. It might not be matched to blue, cyan, and green because the combinations are a little bit off. And we could actually go look at this specific wiring for this LED to make sure it's correct. Let's see how we do here. Let's go D04, and let's change our cycle time again. Let's put this back to 1,000 so we can see it nicely. Let's see if I got the wiring correct. But notice that now, so now we're changing the physical thing. That seemed like a big change, but it's actually really easy in the code. One small change. Let's plug her back in, deploy our application, and see what happens. Bring it into frame. And there our colors start cycling. It actually looks like we might be pretty close on the wiring. And I think our camera's fluctuating a little bit with that LED. But you can see that we've done the exact same code but controlled an external RGB LED. So that's it for this session, but please stick around because we're going to go a bit deeper, and I'm going to show you how to rapidly prototype using some helper APIs, some helper classes known as Meadow Foundation. And it's going to allow you to do a lot of these types of things, but with more complex hardware. So please stick around, and I'll be right back.